right, I'd like to get started, and pleasure to introduce Jennifer Welsh, who is first Deputy Commissioner, I'd like to explain what all that is about, of Chicago Department of Family and Support Services. We met at an event maybe a year ago or something like that.
Maybe longer.
I had mentioned the fact that we were going to be developing this course, maybe even 2 years ago.
Yeah, right.
And I mentioned that we were developing this course where we're trying to figure out how government, business, and nonprofits can work together against societal problems. I said, Jennifer, would you be interested maybe in participating in the class? And here you are. So we're excited that you're here and share from the government lens about how to solve the societal issues that are facing the city of Chicago. And then have some time for question and answer and so forth.
Great.
So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Okay, so just to explain my role at DFSS, I'm the first Deputy Commissioner. That means I'm second in command. The way that I explain it to my boss, who is the Commissioner, is that it's my job to deal with everything before it goes to her. Like, I try to stop problems from becoming catastrophes. If I've averted a catastrophe, then I've had a decent day. Which, given the scope of our services, averting a catastrophe is not an easy thing. So, Department of Family and Support Services serves Chicago's most vulnerable citizens. We do everything from early childhood services, and that is for children in poverty, to home-delivered meals for homebound seniors, and pretty much every vulnerable population in between. So we're talking about homelessness, domestic violence, ex-offenders returning to the workforce, veterans trying to reintegrate into society, opportunity youth, which we used to call at-risk youth until we realized we should define it in the positive. So sometimes I might go back to the old phrase on that. People who have been involved, youth and adults who have been involved in the criminal legal system and are trying to reintegrate. So pretty much every vulnerable population comes within the scope of Department of Family and Support Services. It's a very challenging group, especially, I was telling our colleague here, especially right now, when the economy still sucks and the not-for-profit community is beleaguered by the funding situation, by the economic crisis and the crisis in Springfield, which is really harming their funding even more. A little bit more about our department. 3 is like the magic number for us. It just turns out that way. We end up helping about 300,000 people every year. And that just gives you an idea of the scope of people that we're dealing with. We have just over 300 delegate agencies. In the city of Chicago, we call our grantees delegate agencies because we are delegating the responsibility of doing the work. So even though I ran the domestic violence division, I didn't do domestic violence work. I funded agencies to do the direct services, whether that's a statewide hotline or court services. So we delegate the work. Our budget, actually, now it's a little old. We're about $400 million. So we have this massive budget to do all of these services to the most vulnerable people, the people who really need the most from the city of Chicago, because they don't just need roads and schools like you and I do, they also need a counselor to help them find housing. They need permanent supportive housing. They need job training to help them reintegrate into society after incarceration. So that's just giving you an idea of the population. Interesting fact, the vast majority of our department, of our 330, that was last year's budget, of our 330 is grants. So other governments give us money to take care of these populations. The feds probably give us about 50%. And that's through Community Development Block Grant, Community Services Block Grant, tons of grants come from the feds to the city to take care of this, and then a significant portion from the state as well. So we're essentially spending other people's money. The mayor is never going to balance the budget on us because very little of our money actually comes from the city of Chicago. So we also get private grant funds from foundations and corporations to pull off some of our projects, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today. Just to give you a little bit more of an overview. So these are the 7 program areas that we have. I think I've mentioned all of them. Today I'm going to focus on two program areas. I'm going to focus on youth, and I'm going to focus on domestic violence, because these are two great examples that I have of public-private partnerships that have made a vast difference in the city of Chicago. Okay, so first, overview of youth services. For most of our programs, the goal is really simple. It's keeping youth safe. And so really, even though we're not doing violence prevention services directly, we look at all of our services through a violence prevention lens. And that's both in who we choose to serve and what we choose to do with our time and money, especially for our after-school programs and our out-of-school, so summer and breaks, and our workforce programs. We're focusing on we're addressing the challenges that youth face. We acknowledge the fact that it can be challenging to be a young person in the city of Chicago, especially a young person of color. And that's who we're really focused on serving here. And again, I'm going to keep talking about this. About 150 agencies. So if you remember, I said our department had about 300 delegates. Half of them are right here in the youth arena. So this is really where we're dealing with the most community agencies. And when I talk to city council, I'm able to say, we're in your community. I can guarantee it because I have a map of 77 community areas in the city of Chicago, and I draw youth from every single one of those communities. When I put that map up, the aldermen are kind of surprised because I think they think, oh, you're not working in my community, whatever it is. But we are. We're in every community area in the city of Chicago. 200 different programs. So we have some agencies that are so good at it or so experienced at it that we're giving them funding for multiple program models that we have here. And last year, and we have services in 51 of the 77, but I draw youth from all 77 of the program areas. And last year we served more than 12,000 kids. And again, we're focusing on the most vulnerable, the most at risk, or our opportunity youth. The program that I'm really going to focus on is our summer youth employment. This kid was great. He actually painted a viaduct with the mayor last summer, and he seriously ended up painting like everything, like himself, the ground. It was really fun. But what we do for our our summer youth program, is we provide jobs for youth, and youth is very broadly defined in the city of Chicago, age 14 to 24. So I think that's probably, certainly before I came to the city, I don't know if I would have defined youth as 14 to 24, but we're trying to serve that whole population. The goal is to increase employability, to give them job readiness experience, to teach them about getting into the workforce, to give them their first step into that, to develop transferable skills. And then the added benefit, the not-so-secret benefit, is to keep youth off the street, to keep them engaged in their community, and to help move money into their community economies. Because these youth self-report that they're spending money on helping out with rent, and helping out with food, and helping out with household expenses. They're spending money in their communities. So it's just a sort of a massive employment and community revitalization program that we're putting together. The photo is from the infrastructure project that we did this summer. We call the whole project One Summer Chicago. I don't know if you've ever seen this logo around. You'll see it coming up pretty soon because it's time for kids to start applying for summer jobs. So you'll see this on buses and viaducts and everything.
T-shirts too.
T-shirts,
Yeah.
bright orange T-shirts. Yeah, right. In fact, I might have a picture of a group of kids in those T-shirts. Right. Yeah. So what we do through One Summer is a very good indication of what my department does in this role. And what we do is coordinate through multiple levels of government, so not just the Department of Family and Sports Services, but the buildings department in the city of Chicago, the streets and sands. So just imagine the sort of lineup of city departments that might be involved in this. A lot of youth work at libraries over the summer. Obviously, a ton of youth work at Chicago Park Districts. because they're youth counselors for younger kids. So we bring together not only, we call them our sister agencies in the city of Chicago, but then agencies in Cook County, like the Cook County Forest Preserves. Again, the kids are working, in those locations in the summer. And more important to your purpose, the other piece that we bring in is private businesses, and that's private businesses to help place the youth in employment and also to help fund the project. So the Magic Johnson Foundation gave millions of dollars to this project 2 years ago. We're still using the funds that foundation gave to this project. Citibank, TFC Bank, and others. So private industry has dedicated funding to this because they're committed to violence prevention in the city of Chicago, and also because they're trying to build themselves a viable workforce for the future by training Chicagoans right now. So it works out really usefully for everyone. Other private industries that are involved, Walmart, Starbucks. Starbucks has a massive workforce program for Opportunity Youth in the city of Chicago. And they don't just fund the project, but they had special training for our youth. And they did a massive, one-day job fair for our youth. And I wish I should have had the number. A number, and it was a really lovely number that made our youth deputies so happy. You do this whole massive one-day job fair, and I wish I could say it was 200, but I think that's way too optimistic. But just a number of youth left that day with jobs at Starbucks, which are all over the place, so it was easy for them to get to in their own communities. And Starbucks is a good employer. I don't know if anybody has had friends or worked for them. It's a good employer. It's known for having good employee benefits. Great place to start for the young people. So that's how private businesses are involved in this project as well. Interestingly enough, One Summer Chicago begins in March. So the application will go out for youth in mid-March this year. And the delegate agencies that we work with will help spread that application across the city of Chicago. So schools will be advertising that, youth programs, after-school programs, sports programs, all telling youth, come on, apply for One Summer Chicago. And the application is designed to be completed on a smartphone instead of a computer. We asked our youth what technology they were using to submit the application, and they all told us they were using handheld devices. They weren't using desktops. I don't even know if they know what those are, but they weren't even using laptops. They were all using phones. So we made sure that the application was phone friendly. It's handheld friendly. And that was developed with a partnership of a separate consulting non-for-profit. So again, just all these groups have to come together to make this thing work, besides the private nonprofits and the government agencies. Our delegates then staff up in April and May. They hire first the mentors, which are slightly older youth, so that's probably where you're getting the 20 to 24-year-olds. You hire 10 of those to be the mentors in your community. And then that nonprofit hires 100 youth to work in the summer. And the youth work for the the youth are placed by the non-for-profit in the various workplaces that we've talked about. The non-for-profit provides training and structure, the mentor, and workforce preparedness stuff. So the non-for-profit provides the structure. The youth might go to multiple workplaces. Some of them could be working at the Park District, some of them could be working in a library, some of them could be working at Starbucks, some of them could be working at Walmart. They can be placed all over, but it's their non-for-profit that centralizes their summer experience. The kids start their jobs, so the mentors and the programs do all their training through June, and then the kids start their jobs either right at the last week of June or early July. And then they work for 6 to 8 weeks. In some cases, we've extended programs as long as 10 weeks for their summer jobs. So of all of those kids, we had 10,000 youth complete a survey at the end of the summer last year. 80% of them said that they found a sense of purpose and meaning from what they did in the summer. This is them self-reporting on how it impacted them. 70% of those youth reported that, I want to make sure I get this right, the experience helped them see that earning a high school diploma or a college degree is helpful to their life goals. Because they're in workplaces, they're meeting people from all different walks of life and at all different levels. Their mentors are coaching them, and they're just seeing a lot of different values. My personal favorite, 80% out of the 10,000 youth surveyed said that their one summer Chicago work experience made them more hopeful about their future in Chicago. And we think part of that is because we're transporting them around the city. We're taking them to, they painted hundreds of viaducts, for example, last year. We're taking them around to different places. They're seeing all of these different sides of the city. They're meeting people that they haven't met before. A lot of them are working in their communities, but some of them are working in other communities, or they're meeting people from other communities. So we really think that the program, and the youth are telling us that the program, this massive structure that we've built up, is changing their lives. I don't have a picture of it because we couldn't find one, but one of our youth, he was at One Summer Chicago 2 years ago. He had the good fortune to go to Washington, D.C. last year and introduce President Obama at the My Brother's Keeper event. So these kids are just going so far. He was fantastic when he said, these are words that I never thought I would get to say in my life, but I'm going to introduce to you the President of the United States, you know, and we're, of course, like, everybody's in the audience crying. We're watching it on webcast, just bawling, like, what an amazing kid. So here's somebody, he was just a youth participant. Now he's a mentor in the program. I mean, we have, we're convinced that we're going to be voting for him one day for something. But meanwhile, he's moving up in the program, and you can tell that we don't mean to be recruiting, but we know that we've got somebody who's probably going to spend a lifetime of work in public service, whether it's in nonprofit or government work, because he just saw this program work, and it made all the difference in his life. He was an opportunity youth who had dropped out of school, and now he has just a completely different take on Chicago. And I am really proud to be part of a program that can give that to somebody, that can help lead a young person through that process. So that's my story about One Summer Chicago. I think it's a good example, and I wanted to highlight that. And I have one more example that I'm even closer to, but I wanted to just stop here and ask if folks had questions. I know we'll do more Q&A later, big picture, but you know, as I'm trying to sort of run through the program quickly, anybody have questions about One Summer Chicago?
My organization actually is a participant in that, so we were already talking about it. March 14th, actually.
March 14th,
The
right?
portal opens.
I know, earlier than ever before, and hopefully more successfully than ever before. I was really amazed when I heard how many youth were applying online and how they, handheld, and how they changed the application to acknowledge that. So I'm glad to hear it. That's sort of cool.
I used to manage a couple of Jimmy Johns, and I was going to recommend that as a possible partner.
Awesome. Yeah.
I'm not in that field anymore, but I remember how difficult it was to find good help.
Yeah.
And
Pass that resource.
Right? Okay. Cool. That's a great idea. That's a great idea. And if you have a contact, I would love to have it. We could reach out. You know, placing our kids at Starbucks was really a 2-year effort. I don't know if you know Lisa Davis from my office, but I had a colleague who worked 2 years meeting with Starbucks to set up this project because they were interested, but they just couldn't see how a temporary youth employment program could fit into their model. And she really pushed it. She was like, okay, so whatever, you know, we can have a bunch of people for some time, but let's talk about who's going to stay with you long term and how we can model the program to your use. And she stuck with it, and it's a great partnership now. They're both very pleased with it, both Starbucks and obviously the city, thrilled with that partnership. And then Starbucks kicked in some funding too. So yay, they're like employing the kids and helping to pay for the project.
Jimmy is looking at ways to increase his brand, so
Yeah.
market his brand, and that's one way.
Yeah,
So.
cool. All right, we'll take it.
Have you seen any, obviously in the individual kids' lives, obviously there's some really positive things. Have you seen any kind of like community-wide indicators that this program is helping, especially like in the areas like violence reduction and whatnot?
Yeah. You know, it's a challenge. I've done violence prevention work for a very long time. It's really hard to prove the negative. It's really hard to prove that you've prevented violence. What we can see is that for the youth that we employ, they have a lower recidivism rate. We had a massive study from 2 years ago that was actually published in Science magazine. And a woman is getting her PhD studying exclusively our youth, and they have a lower criminal involvement rate, and that's both as perpetrators and as victims of crime. And we've proved that over time. So we know that involvement in the project is helping those kids for sure. It's a little harder to prove. I mean, and I experienced this because my real work, where I come from, and I worked for many years at a domestic violence agency. And when we do a domestic violence effort, the mayor will ask me, so did you get down our domestic violence murder rate? And I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do that. You know, until we solve domestic violence, I'm not going to get down the murder rate. But what I can do is help a lot of people. And I feel like so much of what our work is, it's that same dilemma. I can't solve poverty, so it's really hard for me to decrease homelessness. I can give better services to some homeless people, but it's really hard. Our department, unfortunately, everything we're trying to do is virtually unsolvable. Solving domestic violence, solving homelessness, solving youth violence. Boy, I wish. But it's super hard, and super hard to indicate what we've done. All right, so I keep hinting about this one. So domestic violence, again, this is where I came from. For 10 years before I worked for the government, I ran a domestic violence agency. This one I can talk about all day, every day. It's this was my passion. This was my first calling into the world. So the city of Chicago funds a lot of domestic violence services. See, I'm jumping ahead here. Okay, so funds a lot of domestic violence services. We have a number of program models, but I'm going to focus on domestic violence shelter. Here is, okay, I can do the lineup of sad numbers for you. 20,000 people call the domestic violence hotline annually. Now, that's a statewide hotline, not just the city hotline, because in the late 90s, we developed a statewide domestic violence. Well, we developed a citywide domestic violence hotline that was so successful, the state paid us to roll it out statewide. So from the city of Chicago, we run the statewide domestic violence hotline, 20,000 calls a day. Calls to police for domestic violence are over 400 a day. So the Chicago Police Department responds to an average of more than 400 domestic calls each and every day. And we had, before this project, 115 domestic violence shelter beds in the city of Chicago. So think about those numbers, 20,000 calls a year, 400 calls to police a day, but then 115 shelter beds. So for the domestic violence victims that needed the biggest intervention, for the domestic violence victims who needed to flee their homes and go live somewhere else, we had very few beds. It was a major problem, and something that I definitely dedicated myself to fixing. So that's where this comes in. This is a former police station. From what we can tell, it was built in the 1880s. It was a freaking bunker of a building. And what we did with it was turn it into, a new domestic violence shelter. The city's first new domestic violence shelter. The mayor says in more than 10 years, because none of us can remember when the previous new domestic violence shelter was. Does that make sense? Like, it's just so long ago that we're like, it's been at least a decade since we built a new shelter, so we sort of stuck with that because we couldn't narrow it down. So you can see here, that's that ugly police station, right? There's our bunker. It now, and I don't have a picture of it because we haven't been able to get that picture that's as beautiful as the rendering. But it's there now. It opened last week. So the Wings Metro Domestic Violence Shelter opened last week. And it has 40 beds for domestic violence victims and their children. At any given time, every domestic violence shelter in the city of Chicago is full. We are at 100% occupancy. We're actually a little higher than that, but they don't like to report it because then that means that they're like out of zoning. But what happens is the shelter has probably 1/3 adult women and 2/3 children, because the women who come into shelter are fleeing with their kids. And so a 40-bed domestic violence shelter probably has about 39 to 45 people. Some of them are kids in cribs, and so we're looking at serving probably more than 100 different people before this year is out who are going to stay at this new shelter. And this shelter also has 3 apartments for people who graduate from the shelter situation but still need more time and support within the program. So it's a sort of a transitional housing from the congregate living situation that is the domestic violence shelter to apartment living within the same facility. That's actually upstairs here in our old bunker. So at any given time, there's probably about 65 people living in this building. Again, about 1/3 domestic violence victims and 2/3 their children survivors of domestic violence. That's what you're going to have in this building. The thing that is so unique about it is the way we put it together. I don't know if anybody saw this in the press or if anybody heard about this project. 3 years ago, actually now it's like 3.5 years ago, in November of 2012, the city of Chicago settled a lawsuit with the VIP Gentlemen's Club. So a strip club settled a lawsuit, and we had about $2.2 million, and the mayor said, build me a new shelter. Because when he had talked to me about domestic violence services before, I had explained to him the numbers and how few beds we had. So the mayor got a one-time cash settlement of $2.2 million, and he's like, okay, build me a new shelter. Okay, like this has been a crusade of mine for years. I am happy to take it on, but $2.2 million is unfortunately not going to build us a new shelter. The final cost on this thing was about $7 million. Now, it's a beauty. I worked, so after I ran a non-for-profit, I worked for 8 years for Attorney General Madigan, and I have seen every domestic violence shelter in the state of Illinois. I've seen some good ones, and I've seen some really tough ones. Because if you think about it, domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters are the same thing. They're hardly ever built to be that. So in Quincy, Illinois, the domestic violence shelter is a former orphanage. It's this big old crazy mansion with all these little warrens of rooms. It was an orphanage, and now it's a domestic violence shelter. In Princeton, Illinois, the domestic violence shelter was a former juvenile detention facility for juvenile sex offenders. Now it's a domestic violence shelter, right? So I've seen some pretty ugly places. Nothing compares to this. This is the Cadillac of domestic violence shelters, and it cost over $7 million. But the city started with a $1.8 million. I put out an RFP, a request for proposals, for $1.8 million. And I said, the city of Chicago will build a new domestic violence shelter. And I said, it must be south of, and I can't remember the street. I should remember the street because it was so important. I think it was south of Cermak. I said, because I did a map of all of the calls to police for domestic violence services, overlaid that with a map of all the calls to the domestic violence hotline, and then overlaid that with a map of where the existing shelters were. And there were some places that had a lot of need for services and no services there. So I looked at the map and I said, all right, there are just a few places where this shelter can be. Put out the RFP, got some responses, and the thing that was totally unique, and I have to go back a few slides for this, the thing that was totally unique about the proposal that we awarded it to was that it was a partnership of 3 separate non-for-profits. Metropolitan Family Services, which is one of the biggest social service providers in the city of Chicago, actually in the whole Chicagoland area, they all go all the way to DuPage. So, massive experienced social service provider. Greater Southwest Development Corporation is an SSA. I don't even know what SSA stands for. It's like the Chamber of Commerce down on the southwest side of Chicago. They're an experienced developer and experienced builder. They have experience with senior housing and community revitalization, like turning a decrepit building into a nice new strip mall, if that's not an oxymoron, but, so they're a known, well-respected, and completely embedded in the community. They're like the ones who hang up the signs down your street and make sure the plantings all match on a commercial area, Greater Southwest. And then Wings is an experienced domestic violence service provider, but from the suburbs, never had a project in the city before. So these 3 get together and they say, we're going to put it on the south side, where Greater Southwest is totally known. We're going to wrap around services, everything from childcare to legal services provided by Metropolitan Family Services, and my known shelter provider is going to run the shelter. I couldn't fund it fast enough. It was a beautiful proposal, amazingly well put together, and a great partnership. And the last piece, so you've got the city putting in the seed money, basically, these 3 non-for-profits coming in, and then where do you think the gap between the 1.8 that we started with and the 7+ million? That was the private enterprise. That was foundations and corporations supporting it. That was massive amounts of donations from every imaginable business got in on this. Oh wait, I show you. So this is possibly the best picture of the new shelter. This is real. The cell block in the police station is now the playroom. The playroom, everything in it, the toys, the furniture, the decoration, donated by the Land of Nod. So, Land of Nod, Panasonic donated more technology than any tech guru has in their house. Art Van Furniture donated beds and dressers and couches, massive amounts of donated goods and services. So the Ozinga donated the cement and poured the cement block for no cost to the project. So massive amounts of in-kind services and goods to build the shelter. And then just a massive amount of fundraising. The Bears Foundation, let's see, do I have a picture of that? The Bears Foundation built a fully accessible playground. McCaskey, every time he goes to the building, he cries and writes another $10,000 check. I think they just invent excuses to get him out there at this point. He probably doesn't want for me to say that. He's really like, he's like, I just had to do something, but tons of businesses and foundations have come in on this. And it would not have been possible without this highly unique 3-part partnership. Government starting it, the seed money, the mayor's insistence and my persistence to make this happen. Every city department, it felt like, had to be in on it because the property was still owned by the city of Chicago. In addition to the seed money that the city put into it, we gifted the former police station and the empty lots next to it to the project. And then we had to work with the law department because when you gift a non-for-profit a pile of former city land. It turns out it's not easy. I never knew that before, but it was really complicated. I learned about a redevelopment agreement and all of these other legal instruments, and then the buildings department had to get into it. So the Department of Planning and Development had to get into it. So we had about, I think we figured out it was 5 or 6 city departments, 3 non-for-profits, and when it came down to it, I think it was probably about 15 corporations that made significant in-kind donations, and probably about an additional 20 foundations and corporations that made significant monetary donations. And that's the only way that the city of Chicago could have possibly pulled off building a new domestic violence shelter, because it's a massive expense and a huge building undertaking, right? So we started it, you guys can see the timeline. The mayor makes this decision in November of 2012. We released the RFP in February of 2013, choose the vendor. We break ground in November, and Vice President Biden came out for the groundbreaking because the mayor and Biden worked together in the Clinton White House when Biden was in the Senate and the mayor worked for the Clintons to pass the Violence Against Women Act. So these guys go way back together on violence against women. So Biden comes to the groundbreaking in November of 13. Then what happens? What was that? The polar vortex. Turns out you cannot work on construction during a polar vortex. So our construction was completely stalled. We couldn't even do the environmental testing that we needed to do. So then we stalled for like, it was seriously, it was so freaking long because we kept trying to go back into the property and do the drillings to do the environmental testings, and everything was still frozen. So the polar vortex probably cost us about 7 months of construction time. And then when you're getting so much of the materials donated, you end up doing things on their time. So Ozinga's going to give you all the cement, but when are they going to give you the cement? And when are they going to give you the guys to do it? So things took probably a little bit longer, but it would not have been possible without the constant interactions between all these groups. So that's how we get from bunker to beautiful shelter. And like I said, groundbreaking, let's see, I might have one more picture. Groundbreaking, November 2013, ribbon cutting. Oh wait, I do have the beers. Okay, right, yeah. So this officer, this looks a little wacky, I know, but so the Bears put in a completely accessible playground, right? It's all wheelchair ramps and slides and ladders and stuff.
Bears colors too.
And he made a point about that. He made a point about that in his speech, that he wasn't going to have any yellow or green. He definitely. And there was at one of the events a ways back, the construction company had green helmets, and he painted it over with white before he would wear it. So yeah, right. Another interesting fact about this particular police department, that particular police department had an officer there, a woman who was a single mom with 5 kids, who was killed by her abuser. So she's a Chicago police officer. Her abuser, I believe, was a Cook County sheriff, and he killed her. And she worked at the police station that I showed you the picture of. She worked at the bunker. So in this, right here next to the playground, is a Brenda Sexton Memorial Garden. And so when we did the opening of the garden and the playground, the place was full of cops because they had all worked with this woman at the former police station that we had now turned into a domestic violence shelter. Her 5 children have been at every event. The youngest was 4 months old when her mother was killed. She is now, every time I see this girl, she's now 15 years old. She is the most confident, self-possessed person I have. I had a fraction of her confidence at 15. I might still have a fraction of her confidence. And she has now given 3 speeches at events at the new shelter. So 5 kids, she's the youngest, she's the baby. She has no memory of her mother because she was about 4 months old when her mother was murdered. And her siblings make her the spokesperson. So at the opening of the garden, at the ribbon cutting of the shelter, this Morgan, the youngest, is the one who speaks every time. Amazing young woman. So you just like imagine all of the things that go into this. The garden, of course, is donated by Christy Weber, who's one of the massive landscapers here in the city of Chicago. The garden's donated by Christy Weber. The play lot is donated by the Bears. All of these people come together. So this is a picture of the groundbreaking, which just happened last week. An amazing project, and tons of people put it together. This young woman right here is a domestic violence survivor and an artist. She made this art that you see behind you, all the officials here. She made the art in that room and every room in the building. So she's a domestic violence survivor who runs art therapy programs for other survivors, and they put their art all over the building. So you can see a little bit back here, John and Rita Canning. They're pretty famous Chicago real estate developers. They donated $1 million match grant to this project. And you see this kind of stuff all over the shelter because every room is a named room. So the dining room isn't just the dining room, it's the Verizon Cafe to give Verizon the thanks for the money that they donated to the project, which was $500,000. So this obviously, my pet project, it represents 3 years of my life, and constant meeting. You guys have all heard the phrase of herding cats. Well, that's what happens when you're trying to build a new domestic violence shelter in the city of Chicago on donated land with 3 different nonprofits, significant donated materials, and the constant need to fundraise as you're doing it, right? Because we broke ground when we really only had about $2.5 million, and we were making the money as we went along. This young woman here is Rebecca Dar. That's McCaskey right here. You can tell because he has a Bears button on. Rebecca Dar is the executive director, the most prolific fundraiser. She's the executive director of Wings. This project is called Wings Metro, and Rebecca is the most prolific fundraiser I've ever met in my life. And I come from the not-for-profit community. Like, I want to be here when I grow up. She's amazing. So that's the story of Wings Metro. And I already talked to you about one summer, and so I'm going to give you guys a chance to ask any questions and also give you my contact information, rather our department's contact information, because that's who you really need to know about. So, what can I tell you?
You said that there was 115 beds. Is that the state of Illinois or is that Chicago?
That's the city of Chicago. The fact of the matter is that a large number of city domestic violence victims relocate to the nearby suburbs, sometimes because they want to be away from their abuser, and other times because they need to, because there's no space here. So the Evanston Domestic Violence Shelter, the Tinley Park Domestic Violence Shelter, at any given time is probably 50% city residents as well.
So how many beds are there in the state of Illinois?
Tag, I don't know.
Okay.
Don't know that one. I used to, but lost that number
What
somewhere.
would you say the percentages then based in the city and then based outside the city?
You know what? I think that because domestic violence shelters are so expensive to build and run, the numbers are pretty sparse everywhere. You know what I mean? There's one shelter in Peoria. There's one shelter in Bloomington. There's one shelter in Champaign. It's not like there's a lot of shelter space anywhere in the state of Illinois. Now, interestingly, in southern Illinois, where folks are a little bit more sparse, the shelters aren't always full 100% of the time, because even though you're the one shelter in Carbondale, it might not always be that there are 40 domestic violence victims who need to be in shelter in Carbondale. Whereas in Chicago, our shelters are always full.
Have you been known to relocate someone that far away if the matter is that urgent?
Absolutely. And even out of state. Absolutely. The shelters work really closely together. And in the state, it's super easy because we all have a centralized domestic violence hotline. And that hotline keeps track of what shelters have space at any given time. Before we had the hotline, and I had the good fortune to develop that project at a previous job. Before we had a hotline, if you were a domestic violence victim and you needed to stay somewhere, you would call Rainbow House. Oh, Rainbow House says no space. Call Greenhouse. Oh, Greenhouse says no space. Call Family Rescue. Family Rescue's got space. Can you get down to the southwest side? Now, the hotline has all that info. You call, you say, I have 3 children. We prefer to speak Spanish. And they say, okay, here are your choices. Greenhouse has space, or sorry, nobody has space right now, but I'm going to hook you up with legal services or counseling services or advocacy services in the interim.
So, question. So, in this class, we've kind of been studying and reading about different business models or different models in general that have accomplished the same thing but through non-traditional means. So, have you looked at, because these buildings are beautiful, but they're also $7 million, right?
Right.
Have you looked at different ways? For instance, now I can rent out my bedroom on Airbnb, or I can use my car as a taxi using Uber. Or I can even, if I have an extra, a tool, I can rent it out on. I forget the name escapes me now, but there's a website that's similar to that. Have you looked at a model that might be more similar to, say, foster care, where you could, instead of paying to run these buildings, provide funding to private citizens to house them using extra bedrooms that might be available, similar to, say, foster care?
Yeah, exactly. We have. And I'll tell you about 2 models. One, we've looked into it and actually spent years looking into it, specifically for the LGBT community. Because LGBT folks were like, yeah, that's nice that you have a 40-bed shelter, but it's homonormative and most people there don't look like me. Their partner was a man, not a woman, right? So for the LGBT folks, the traditional shelter model wasn't really working for them. And so we looked at essentially an Airbnb model for housing LGBT survivors. And it ended up not working out. People couldn't get past the safety concerns, the confidentiality requirements, because that's the thing. All of these shelters, every DV program in the state of Illinois, highly confidential. You notice I did not tell you the address. I did not tell you what former police station. That address is protected. We have been militant in the press of protecting it. If you know what bunker it is, maybe you can figure out what station it is. But so domestic violence victims flee to places with confidential addresses. And we couldn't figure out a way, especially in the LGBT community, which can feel a little small in Chicago, to find houses that were safe to go to, where it wouldn't be like, oh, I left my abuser, and now I'm getting placed in her best friend's apartment. Rats, we couldn't figure out a way to protect safety and confidentiality all at the same time in that model. Now, Wings does a sort of a different version of it. In the suburbs, people give them houses, right? I don't know, if you just have a spare house hanging around, you don't know what to do with it, you give it to Wings, and then they move 2 domestic violence families into it. So it's just your average house on a suburban street. It doesn't look like a domestic violence shelter. It's not a domestic violence shelter, but it's 2 families living together in a house that was gifted to Wings. So that's 2 possibilities. The Airbnb model turned out we couldn't work it out, but the more like scattered site housing does work. Again, it's all confidential addresses, right? And I don't know what they would do if a place got sort of outed as, oh, that's a domestic violence house. I don't know what they would do.
Probably safety would be your concern.
Absolutely.
That's why you would
Right.
have to almost have it confidential like that.
That's right, because unfortunately, there's still some NIMBYism, right? People think, I can remember before we built the new domestic violence courthouse in the Western Loop, we looked at building it in an unused building right in River North on the Chicago River. And the neighbors, like the River North Neighbors Association, was like, oh, no, we don't want any of that there. And me, being the advocate that I was, printed a map of the latest police calls for domestic violence from that area. And I was like, guess what? you already have abusers in your neighborhood. No neighborhood is exempt. But people still think like, oh, that's dangerous. You put a shelter there, that's dangerous. So you have to, the neighbors might complain when you try to move a shelter. We worked really closely with the neighbors. That was one of the benefits of all that time we had during the polar vortex, that we could work with the neighbors so they didn't complain about the possibility of a shelter. In fact, they were highly supportive of it. But maybe more so in homeless shelters, but also in domestic violence. People hear, like, not in my neighborhood. They do that NIMBY stuff.
Youth homes, they don't either.
Right. I know, and that's the thing. And like, especially with the homeless problem, right? Like, we have more homeless people than we have places to put them right now. It's a tragedy, but it's the truth. And it's not as if we can build more shelters. It's not as if any alderman is like, yeah, that's what I want. I want a homeless shelter on the, my intersection. So it's a real challenge.
So you mentioned that you put out an RFP and 3 nonprofits came together. What was obviously the benefit of that is just having knowledge from 3 different sources, but
Yeah.
then what's the challenge of that as well?
That's a fantastic question. And the challenge of it is different expertise and different cultures. So one of the nonprofits had a total of like get her done culture, like we'll figure that out, and they were totally like building the train as it was barreling down the tracks. And one of the other non-for-profits was like, no, that's not the way we do things. And so I would have to mediate between the two of them. We had a weekly call where we would give updates, and every time after the weekly call, I would hang up with the group call, and then I would get one of them on the phone, talk them down, hang up with them, get the other one on the call, talk them down. So the group call was like processed before and after meticulously, right? Because you have just different cultures. Now, everybody loves each other now because it's beautiful and it's fantastic, but whew, man, there were definitely times when they were ready to walk from the deal. Seriously, this thing almost died a couple of times because different cultures, even in the department, so I'm Department of Family and Support Services. I have experience funding domestic violence services. I have previously no experience building anything, right? And all of a sudden, I'm learning about redevelopment agreements and environmental testings and zoning permits and occupancy. Jesus, I learned so much about building. And same thing, our departments would be at each other's throats because I was like, every time the mayor sees my commissioner, he says, when is my shelter going to be open? For 3 years, we're like, it's coming real soon. Like, he's a little tired of that answer. And law was like, well, you got to dot some more I's and cross some more T's. And I was like, do you not hear me? The mayor is going to fire me. Like, it's not going to happen if I'm not here. So, yeah, different cultures is probably the biggest challenge.
I had a question about the problem of domestic violence more generally. I have very little experience in the court systems, but one time I did observe that someone who had hit my son with his car and so forth ended up in court, and it turned out that the person that hit my son, everybody's okay, no problem, but he had this long record of vehicle issues, of crashing things and drunk driving, and it was a long sheet of things. And they essentially just slapped his hand at the end and really didn't do much to him. I'm wondering if you could talk about how domestic violence is being handled from the courts on the other side of the abusers. Are they just getting hand slaps? Are they actually being put away and so forth? And how about the problem from that point of view?
I'm happy to talk about it, though it's a little hard to talk about it without feeling like I'm getting political with the current state's attorney race. Because it's the Cook County State's Attorney's Office that prosecutes domestic abusers. And I have worked very closely with the current Cook County State's Attorney. For 8 years, her and her team and I have a meeting with them at 9:30 tomorrow morning. So you want to talk about partnerships, like we have worked really closely to hold abusers accountable. That's the language that we use in the court system. And it's a really complex problem. Okay, so your experience in vehicle, court is not a very, well, I think most people's experience in the criminal legal system is that it's not a very efficient system. It doesn't appear to be a great way to handle most things, right? Like court, I don't know, it's just, I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I'm not confident of the system. I don't practice law for a reason. But I feel like in the domestic violence arena, we have worked very hard for a long time to make the system, we always say two things. One, it has to work better for victims, and it has to hold abusers accountable.
Yeah.
In the domestic violence arena, finishing a prosecution might not always be the goal of the domestic violence victim. And the goal of the domestic violence victim has to trump, I'm sorry, this is quite a lecture, but yeah, this is where I come from, this is where my heart is. This is why I went to law school, so I could like learn all the lingo and nobody could say, you don't understand. I'm like, no, when I wrote that law, I pretty much had this in mind, so don't, you know. So victims' needs, victims' desires trump. And I have spent years educating prosecutors that that's the thing. So if the victim doesn't want to go forward for whatever reason, because of financial reasons or fear or own concerns about safety, or maybe their needs were met by the first appearance or the mere threat of court. So I think we're getting better. That's a really long answer to I think we're getting better. On the other side, I can't point to a decrease in domestic violence homicides to prove that. Domestic violence homicides have remained very steady since the 90s here in Illinois. We have between 30 and 40 domestic violence homicides. I've been tracking it for more than 20 years.
Per year.
Per year in the city of Chicago.
Wait, say that again, sorry?
Between 30 and 40 domestic violence homicides annually in the city of Chicago. And nothing that I have done over the course of my career, and I've been at this for more than 20 years here in the city of Chicago, has impacted that. I worked in the not-for-profit arena, and then I worked at the Attorney General's office, and now I work for the city of Chicago, and I honestly haven't moved that homicide rate. I hope to God I've moved a lot of other things. That homicide rate, I don't know, we're done.
Are there other indicators that you keep track of?
Mostly, that's a challenge in our world because it tends to be process indicators instead of outcome indicators. Again, I can't prove that a domestic violence victim is safer. I can have her self-report that she is more aware of her options, that she feels safer, that she feels more empowered. I can say, these are the nights of shelter, these are the numbers of orders of protection, these are the hours of counseling. But I can't say, is it better? Yeah, it's tricky stuff.
So, about these different programs like One Summer Chicago or wherever you do partnership with nonprofits and private organizations, do you have like already a list of nonprofits that you want to work with, or you ask for applications and go through it and decide on it? Like how do you decide on which partners to choose and which one?
Yeah, it's the latter, that we put it out. Everything that we do is public and transparent. So we put out an RFP, request for proposals, that says the city of Chicago intends to give away money to do X, Y, and Z. And then all the not-for-profits put in their proposals, and some of them propose to do F and Q, and we're like, okay, we're not funding them. We're funding the ones who have agreed to do X, Y, and Z, and we're funding the ones who have a demonstrated ability to do X, Y, and Z. Or, you know, they're like, if you think about what I said about the shelter, I said it must be this geography, you know. So we put up our criteria, it's all public, and then we pick the nonprofits that match those criteria, and we fund those. Everything that we do is 100% transparent out there in the public. And I work really hard on that end of it. I'm trying to make sure that we're giving our money to the best non-for-profits. And best doesn't mean biggest. I mean, it is true that in this case we worked with Metropolitan Family Services, one of the biggest, but best might mean proven in this community. So if I'm trying to serve Austin, that's not going to be Metropolitan Family Services. That's going to be an Austin-based organization that has expertise in that community, and people will want to go to services in that community. So BEST can have a lot of different criteria, and we look at all of those when we choose. Yeah, so we are churning out RFPs all the time and getting proposals in all the time, and we have a very disciplined system for reading and reviewing proposals that we've created. Yeah, it's again, and that's the gateway for non-for-profits to come into the city funding world. our department, the Department of Family and Support Services, has the most non-for-profits that we work with, right? If you think about other city departments, buildings, or Department of Planning and Development, even Department of Public Health works with a lot of non-for-profits, but we have the most in the city, like probably more than every other department added up. We're the big players in the non-for-profit human services arena.
I'm sure you mentioned this at the start, but can you say again how the state budget's impasse is affecting DFSS?
Whew, boy, it's a freaking train wreck. Just a freaking train wreck. So, Wayne's is a good example, actually. So, before he left office, Governor Quinn committed $1 million to the project, to the shelter of capital development money. Guess what? We never got it.
Committed, it's not.
Committed. He didn't pay it before he left. He committed it before he left, and Governor Browner did not honor that commitment. Every nonprofit domestic violence agency is funded by the state of Illinois. The state is actually a bigger funder than us, percent of budget-wise. So for the average domestic violence agency, their funding might be 50% from the state of Illinois, 25% from the city of Chicago, and then 25% foundations and corporations. It's just a ballpark, but it's a pretty, a pretty good basis of one. And the state hasn't paid any domestic violence provider since November. So if 50% of your funding is missing for December, January, February, we're worried that they're going to have to close in March. So we're trying to get out all of our money. We're trying to help them get private money. We're trying to lobby the state for them to pay their share of the money. So we could still be paying them, but if we were only 25% of their budget, they might not be able to keep their doors open. And that is definitely the case for domestic violence agencies, homeless agencies. A lot of different subcategories of our programming are suffering because the state is so far behind on their payments, or just saying, like, we're out. We're not going to meet those commitments. It's honestly, the human services safety net is dissolving right now in the state of Illinois before our eyes. Absolutely. It's an absolute crisis. Sorry. Total bummer, but fact right now. Bad time. And if an agency closes, so let's say the average domestic violence agency, which serves 100 domestic violence victims, if it closes, there's not like there's anybody else who's going to pick that up. That's just 100 people who didn't get what they were getting to help them get safe. And it's that case in everything. So if a homeless shelter closes, that's that many more people out on the street. Or if a substance abuse Haymarket, which is one of the biggest substance abuse providers, closed 2 programs already this year. So that's, I think it was 24 beds for people who were in poverty and had substance abuse programs. Beds are gone. I think those people are just out on the street.
Mental health is the same.
Boy, I can't even believe
I was coming over here and literally I was stuck in traffic for 15 minutes because a woman was in the middle of the street dancing with sunglasses on. And, so you go through the emotion of anger and then, and it's kind of funny, but then it's not because she has a mental illness and there's no place for her to go.
That's right.
Because there's just no funding.
That's exact. Yeah. And I think that we are on the edge of a human service catastrophe. And it's happening across services. So, mental health, substance abuse, domestic violence, homelessness, teen after-school programs. I mean, there are some people who say that the increase in violence that Chicago is experiencing is directly related to the defunding of youth programs. Some people insist that, like, duh, I could have told you that. I saw that coming. I warned you. Yeah. a tough time right now. So go figure all this stuff out. Enterprise us some new nonprofits, and we really, I mean, I'm working with other foundations, other funders, to try and bolster the nonprofit services community right now in this moment of crisis. You know, we're trying to get agencies to merge instead of close. We're trying to fund them to do their back office stuff so they can focus on the service stuff that they're really good at. And we're trying to, you know, get new investors. Boy, we're trying everything. But this might be the time when new ideas come forth because it's a crisis.
Any final questions?
Yeah, let's land on the